Hello and welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Please don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe. Today we take a look at the case of Carl Dobson, who's a famous grime MC also known as Crazy Titch. Carl Dobson was born on the 31st of January 1983. He is better known as his stage name Crazy Titch. He is a British grime MC who is now serving a life sentence for murder. Crazy Titch was a successful and well-known grime MC during his active period of MCing. Mr. Dobson was born in Plaistow, East London. As a teenager, Mr. Dobson spent 5 years in Feltham Young Offenders Institute for robbery, handling stolen goods, theft, burglary and criminal damage. Upon his release from prison in 2003, Mr. Dobson turned his attention to grime music, a culture which was steadily growing in the UK music industry. Mr. Dobson had become estranged from his brother Dirty Goods during his childhood, but they had later reconnected and became musical collaborators. Mr. Dobson had gained underground fame due to his membership of a grime collective called Boys in the Hood, which featured the members Dirty Goods, Titch's half-brother, Crazy Titch and Delta Force. Amongst his better known work was a single that he released called Sing Along in 2004. And Gully, in which he collaborated with the Sugar Babes Keisha Buchanan.
It's crazy! Mineral connection, yeah! We got the boys in the hood, we got the kids, let's move, 2005!
Growing cold, can't control, emotions overflow. Gotta get up and make that money, no time to wait in line. Hands on down, my time now. Pick it, I'll put it down. Gotta make it girly, no time to wait.
Mr. Dobson also produced a mixtape entitled Crazy Times Volume 1 and appeared on the Grime DVD Practice Hours. In 2006, Mr. Dobson had made an appearance as himself alongside many other MCs on Channel 4's show Dubplate Drama.
Hey man, what's all this? No! No one don't wanna hear that! That's bullshit!
The grime MC Crazy Titch had a reputation for violence during his time in the grime scene. Notorious footage exists of a heated argument between Crazy Titch and another famous UK grime artist who is known as Dizzy Rascal. And there is also footage of Crazy Titch allegedly kidnapping a rival and dumping them naked in the countryside. The music videos for Crazy Titch's most popular hits, I Can See You and Sing Along, received heavy airplay on Channel AKA and Channel U. Mr. Dobson and his stepfather Anthony Green were sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of a 21-year-old Richard Holmes, which had took place in the Chingford Hall estate in Chingford in November of 2005. Possibility for parole was set at a minimum of 30 years, by which time he will be in his 50s. Dirty Goods, who was Crazy Titch's half-brother, was acquitted in the same trial and released a song about its events entitled A Letter to Titch in 2007. The Mac-10 submachine gun used in the murder was found 4 years after the killing. In February 2009, a local drug dealer was sentenced to 7 years imprisonment for its possession. In prison, Mr. Dobson is considered to be a high-profile prisoner and has been able to use prison facilities to record material and hold interviews with the outside media. In 2010, Mr. Dobson released his second mixtape, a sequel to the 2005 Crazy Times, with material having been recorded whilst incarcerated. In 2017, Mr. Dobson appeared on the interlude on Stormzy's album Gang Signs and Prayer, talking to Stormzy over the phone.
Yo.
Yo, gang.
Yes, my brother.
You still don't sound sure.
No, I'm in the booth right now. I'll be there right now.
Alright, let's start it.
In 2020, a lyric video was produced titled Voldemort, which included new audio from Crazy Titch. It was uploaded to YouTube to celebrate Titch's birthday in 2020.
Care not if a man writes hard, man best know that I'm raw. These rappers are just bike arms. What's a man talking for? You can have heart, it's when you...
On the 22nd of June 2020, a YouTube channel called Justice for Titch uploaded a video in which Crazy Titch, also known as Carl Dobson, explains briefly details which have led him to be incarcerated and why he feels of why he was wrongly convicted for the crime of murder. Mr. Dobson also asks for anyone who truly believes in him to go and visit his petition page and sign it. As of today, that petition has 14,000 signatures.
Rubbish to list up. I think rubbish is a polite way to say, do you know, like that, because there was things I was asking that wasn't happening that could have easily proved my innocence or even disprove some lies that was being told in court.
The petition was started by Lisa Stepanovic, and it is a petition to be sent to the Criminal Cases Review Commission. On the petition, it says, "Everyone deserves a fair trial. Justice for Carl Dobson, aka Crazy Titch." The hashtag Justice for Titch campaign is determined that Carl Dobson, aka Crazy Titch, gets justice that has so far been denied to him in the criminal justice system. In 2005, Crazy Titch was a 22-year-old with an exciting future ahead of him. As a pioneer of the grime scene, together with his contemporaries Wiley, Dizzy Rascal and Kano, they were influencing hundreds of thousands of young people across the UK. Their passionate lyric voiced the lived experiences of working class kids while shining a light on our underrepresented communities. Every deprived housing estate was influenced by grime music. It challenged the powers that be and offered a way out. Within months of his career really taking off, Crazy Titch, aka Carl Dobson, was charged with the murder of Richard Holmes in Chingford. Mr. Dobson stood trial in 2006 and was convicted. We believe that the conviction came about because of the combination of injustices. Some of the injustices that Mr. Dobson and his supporters feel that happened are as follows. Character assassination, due to the moral panic over the genre of urban music in the UK at the time. The joint enterprise law, which often convicts individuals for crimes they have not committed, and it is disproportionately young black men who suffer from the joint enterprise law. Anonymous witness testimonies, which deny individuals the right to know their accusers. The police failings, in which the investigation and the handling of witnesses was not done so correctly. The inherent unreliability of eyewitness evidence. The effect of institutional classism and racism within our court system. The failings of representation. The previous solicitor firm representing Crazy Titch was shut down by the Law Society whilst preparing his defence. The petition states that the evidence in Mr. Dobson's case is unsafe and must be challenged again. Everyone deserves a fair trial. Some of the facts we know are in the court records. It was agreed at trial that Titch did not fire the fatal shot. A supposed eyewitness failed to pick out Crazy Titch from an identification parade close to the date of the shooting. 6 months later, the same witness attended another parade and picked him out after admitting that they had seen a photograph of Crazy Titch in the Evening Standard naming him as a suspect. Another supposed eyewitness, said to have been standing with the identifying eyewitness claiming to recognise Crazy Titch, was unable to pick him out of an identification parade very shortly after the shooting. Also, another supposed eyewitness who did pick Crazy Titch out from a lineup admitted they had seen him in photographs and in newspapers or had recognised him from music videos. Mr. Dobson and his legal team have been working with the criminal defence lawyer Commons for the past 18 months to take the case back and present new evidence to the Criminal Case Review Commission. They are seeking to overturn the conviction. Mr. Dobson had applied on 2 separate occasions to have his sentence re-looked over by the Court of Appeals. Lord Justice Keane revealed the outcomes of these applications and said the following: "These are the renewed applications for leave to appeal against conviction. This was after leave having been refused by a single judge. On the 2nd of November 2006 in the Criminal Central Court, before His Honour Judge Barker QC, the Common Sergeant, both applicants were convicted of murder and were sentenced to life imprisonment. A co-defendant, Mr. Mahorn, was acquitted of murder and indeed of the alternative of manslaughter. The victim, Richard Holmes, was shot and killed at about 12:45 AM on the 4th of November 2005 outside the community centre of Chingford Hall Estate in North East London. Mr. Holmes was shot 3 times. There was expert evidence that one shot to the leg had been fired from a converted MAC-10 submachine gun. 2 further shots, one to the arm and the fatal one to the back, which had passed through his heart, had been fired from a .45 revolver. There was also ballistics evidence of a 3rd firearm having been at the scene. Mr. Green and the co-defendant, Mr. Mahorn, lived on the estate at the same address. Mr. Dobson, however, lived in Stratford, East London. It was not alleged by the Crown at the trial that the fatal shot had been fired by any of the 3 defendants. That shot was said to have been fired by a 4th man who was not on trial. But it was alleged that all 3 defendants were jointly responsible for the killing on the basis of joint enterprise. All 3 were alleged to have been part of a gun-carrying group and were to have known what was likely to happen. Mr. Dobson was said to have a MAC-10 submachine gun and was to have fired the shot into the victim's leg. The Crown's case was that Mr. Green and Mr. Mahorn were present and had participated through encouragement. In an interview, Mr. Dobson did not overtly deny presence at the scene. In a prepared statement, he said that at the time of the alleged offence, he was not in possession of a firearm. Mr. Dobson's statement went on to say, "I would further like to confirm that I adamantly deny pointing a gun into the chest of Richard Holmes or shooting Richard Holmes." At trial, he denied being present and had relied on an alibi. In interviews, both Mr. Green and Mr. Mahorn denied presence at the scene of the shooting at the relevant time. At trial, both said they had been on the estate at times that evening but were not present or participating at any time of the shooting. It will be apparent from what we have said that all 3 defendants gave evidence at trial. Events that evening began with some form of confrontation between Mr. Mahorn and Sabah Shah, both of whom were involved with the music business. Things had developed from there. A group of youths, including Mr. Shah and his friend Richard Holmes, went to Mr. Mahorn's address. There was cell site evidence that proved that Mr. Mahorn had telephoned Mr. Dobson and Mr. Green and that they had travelled to the estate along with others. Later that evening, there was a further confrontation between 2 groups, which ultimately led to the death of Richard Holmes. The prosecution case turned largely on the evidence of 3 eyewitnesses who gave evidence anonymously and from behind screens. They were referred to as A, B and F. We do not propose in this judgment to take their evidence in great detail, since this application is for leave. Their 3 accounts varied. In summary, all 3 named Mr. Dobson, who was known as Crazy Titch, as being present at the shooting and as having the MAC-10 submachine gun. The strength of that identification varied between the three of them. Witness F identified Mr. Dobson at an identification parade on the 2nd of February 2006. In his evidence, he described Mr. Dobson as jumping around, excited and shaking a gun. Witness B failed to identify Mr. Dobson at a parade on the 28th of January 2006, but she did so at another subsequent parade. The basis of that identification was challenged. Witness A's evidence was that Mr. Dobson was there at the shooting, but she had failed to pick him out in a video identification parade in November of 2005. As for the other two defendants, Witness F said that they were both there. He already knew Mr. Mahorn, and he identified Mr. Green at an identification parade. Witness F described the applicant, Mr. Green, as saying to Mr. Dobson about another man, "He's okay." That man was allowed to walk away. Witness A identified Mr. Green as having been with Dobson at the time of the shooting. She was firm about that under cross-examination and said that she was not mistaken. Her evidence was that she did not see Mr. Mahorn there, but she thought that he would have been there. Witness B said that Mr. Mahorn was there, but that Green was not. There was, however, evidence that she had named Green on the night of the shooting as being present. The Crown also successfully applied to use evidence of Mr. Dobson and Mr. Green's previous convictions to show that this was not the first time that they were involved in gun crime. The judge unanimously convicted the applicants, Mr. Dobson and Mr. Green, and unanimously acquitted Mr. Mahorn. Mr. Dobson and Mr. Green now contend that the verdicts in their cases were perverse as being inconsistent with the acquittal of Mr. Mahorn. In addition, and indeed connected with that first point, they both argue that the judge was wrong to allow in evidence of their previous convictions, which may go to explain the willingness of the jury to convict the two applicants while acquitting Mr. Mahorn. The appeal court will deal with these issues first before coming to a separate point raised on behalf of Mr. Dobson. It is convenient to take first the issue of admissibility of the previous convictions, as have counsel today. In his ruling, the judge spelled out the basis for the application by the Crowns as follows. Mr. Dobson was convicted of robbery in August the 27th, 1999, whilst using an air pistol with another in a betting shop. He was sentenced to 5 years detention. This, the prosecution say, is relevant to the matter in issue under section 101D of the Criminal Justice Act of 2003, and it shows that the criminal is willing to commit gun crime and is okay with the knowledge of knowing that a gun is being carried by another man. In the case of Mr. Green, he was arrested in May 1994 in possession of a fully loaded semi-automatic handgun, and in the previous 2 days before he was caught with the gun, had held up 2 petrol stations and a store with the handgun and robbed employees. No one saw Mr. Green with a firearm at the community centre when the murder of Mr. Holmes took place, but the prosecution assert that these offences go on to show a willingness to commit gun crime, and whether he would lend himself to gun crime, and also his knowledge of others carrying loaded weapons. It was also revealed that the 3 robberies and firearm offences on part of Mr. Green were committed in Canada. The judge summarised the arguments on behalf of the defence, which were mainly that the convictions did not help on the central issue of identification, and that the prejudicial effect would outweigh the probative value. In his notes, the judge asked 3 questions to himself. Does the history of the conviction establish that the offender is likely to commit the offences of the kind charged? Does that likeliness make it more likely that the defendant committed the offence charged? And is it unjust to rely upon the convictions of the same description or category, and in any event, will the proceedings be unfair if they are omitted? Having posed the 3 questions, the judge continued as follows. The circumstances surrounding the previous convictions of each defendant are different, and I have considered each case in isolation. The points made by counsel have force, and clearly the admission of this evidence against either will have a substantial effect. I bear in mind that these are single convictions, although in the case of Grime, there were several offences involving the same firearm. Further, in his case, they were 12 years ago. I have considered the other evidence in the case, as well as the section 101 1D and section 103 of the Act. In my view, although effectively single convictions, the circumstances demonstrate much force in relation to the offence charged, and the age of Grime's case does not diminish the importance. The critical issue is whether either of these defendants would lend themselves to an attack with firearms. The likeliness in each case has been established. It goes to the heart of the case, and it would not be unjust for them to be revealed. The provisions of the Act are satisfied that I grant the application to place these matters before the jury, and I have in mind that a careful direction must be given in the summing up. On behalf of Mr. Dobson, Mr. Trimmer QC emphasises that his client's previous convictions was allowed in under section 101D, which requires it to be relevant to the important matter in issue between the defendant and the prosecution. He acknowledges that the section 103 renders the issue of whether the defendant has a likeliness to commit the offences of the kind of which he is charged, and this is a matter in issue between the defence and the Crown, except where having such likeliness makes it no more likely that he is guilty. But it is submitted that there was no more important matter in issue to which any such likeliness was relevant. The only important issue, it is said, was whether Mr. Dobson was correctly identified, and his previous conviction could not assist on that. The issue at trial, submits Mr. Trimmer, was whether Mr. Dobson or Mr. Grime would lend themselves to an attack with firearms. The only important issue was identity. It is said that the law still retains identity as a special case, despite the Criminal Justice Act of 2003. Something akin to the signature or striking similarity about the previous offences needs to exist before such an offence or offences can be seen relevant to the issues of identity. That was not the situation in the present case. In addition, Mr. Trimmer challenges whether the previous conviction of his client was capable of establishing the likeliness to commit an offence of the kind his client was being charged with, namely murder. Mr. Dobson stresses that the past conviction was for a robbery involving an air pistol. It had happened 5 years ago when Mr. Dobson was still a youth. It was a single offence committed for the purpose of gain. Certainly it was not strikingly similar. Finally, on behalf of Mr. Dobson on this topic, it is contended that it is unjust to admit this evidence because of the prejudice that it involved, and the judge failed to give the jury an adequate direction as to its relevance. The judge should have told the jury to exercise great care in how they use this bad character evidence. It should have been tied to the issue of identity. The decision of this court in Turnbull on identification requires the judge to identify what evidence may support the identification of the defendant. That was not done so by the judge here. On behalf of the applicant Mr. Grime, Mr. Borelli QC makes similar points on this ground. While adopting what has already been submitted on behalf of Mr. Dobson, Mr. Borelli also emphasises the argument that the likeliness is of no relevance when the defence is one of the alibi and the central issue is the one of identification and the correctness of that identification. It could, it is said, only be relevant if the jury had first been sure that the applicant was present at the scene. While he does not go as so far as to say the previous convictions can never be used to support an identification, Mr. Borelli contends that, in the present case, there were two separate issues in respect of the applicants. First, their presence at the scene, which was denied, and secondly, the participation of the killing if they were present. The likeliness, it is submitted, could only go to the second of those, namely in participation, not in the presence. Furthermore, it is said that the Crown did not seek to have this evidence admitted at trial on the issue of presence at the scene. We turn to consider these arguments. The trial judge posed for himself 3 questions suggested by Rose L.J. in Hansen at paragraph 15. When the Crown seeks the admission of such evidence on the grounds of propensity. We have quoted these questions earlier in this judgment and do not need to repeat them. The first of them deals with the issue of whether the propensity of the relevant kind exists. In Hansen, the court made it clear that no minimum number of previous convictions is required to demonstrate a propensity. It very much depends on the nature of the previous conviction, its age, and the rest of the factual circumstances. See paragraph 9 in that case. That same paragraph made it clear that there does not have to be, in the words of earlier authorities, a striking similarity. The number of previous convictions will often be relevant if there is only one considerable iniquity without the special distinctive features, and without such offences in the interim, then it may not be capable of establishing such a propensity, in which there was a single firearms offence 20 years earlier. What was also made clear in Hansen at paragraph 15 is that this court will be slow to interfere with a judge's ruling on the admissibility of bad character evidence if the judge has directed himself or herself correctly. It is only if his judgment as to the capacity of the prior events to establish propensity is plainly wrong, or his discretion has been exercised unreasonably, in the Wensbury sense, that this court will interfere. We agree that this is the approach which should be adopted in the court in cases of this kind. On those principles, it seems to us that the judge here was entitled to conclude that the previous convictions in this case and both the applicants were such as to show the propensity to commit gun crime, whether it be a principal or secondary party. In respect of Mr. Dobson, his was a relatively recent conviction involving firearms for criminal purposes. Even though it is only a single conviction, it could, in our view, suffice. In the case of Mr. Green, his convictions for firearm offences and robbery were earlier in time, 1994, but they were several in number and demonstrated a willingness to carry and use firearms for criminal purposes, if only to threaten. One of the offences involved a loaded firearm. The only purpose of having ammunition in the gun could have been for the possibility that it might have to be used. In both their cases, the past offences, as we have indicated, they both involved the use of firearms. If there was such propensity as the judge found, was it relevant to an important matter in an issue between the defence and the Crown? There was here no dispute that Richard Holmes was shot, and indeed shot by 2 different weapons, and that there were others accompanying the gunman who fired the fatal shots. What was in issue was whether these 2 applicants were the men, or some of the men, who were there and were participating in a way alleged in the murder. there was an important matter in issue. We do not accept that the previous convictions showing a particular propensity cannot be relevant to showing that the defendant was the person who committed the crime charged, merely because identity is put in the issue and the alibi raised. Merely because identity is put in issue and an alibi raised, it does not render propensity irrelevant. It will not by itself be enough to establish the identity, but it may often be capable of supporting the credibility and reliability of other evidence of identification. The point as a matter of principle may be more readily appreciated by postulating more extreme circumstances, as where someone accused of sexual assault of a woman in a street pleads that it is not him and provides an alibi. She identifies him as best she can. Would not evidence that he had several recent convictions for similar assaults be admissible to show that it was him on the occasion now charged, and to support the identification evidence by the victim? We are in the view it would be relevant and therefore admissible, subject of course to the judge's usual discretion. We have taken there what may be a more extreme example, but we do so only in order to make the point more obvious. We do not accept Mr. Trimmer's point about the need for striking similarity in the cases where the main issue is identification. Not only is paragraph 9 of Hansen, which was quoted earlier, contrary to that, but the correct test is now to be found in the provisions of the 2003 Act, and in particular for the present purposes of section 101(1)(d). Is it relevant to an important matter in an issue between the defendant and the prosecution? As Mr. Borelli acknowledged, bad character in a sense of previous convictions can, if they demonstrate in a particular propensity, be relevant in the issue of identity, which was crucial in the present case. We entirely accept that the matter of degree whether the propensity is established and whether the propensity is relevant. We entirely accept that it is a matter of degree whether the propensity is established or whether the propensity is relevant, but striking similarity is not the test. This can be appreciated from the decision of this court in R vs Eastlake 2007 EWCA Criminal 603. That was a case in which two male teenagers had been attacked by two males who then ran off. The appellants denied that they were the assailants. They relied on defense of an alibi. They asserted that the identifications of them by witnesses were mistaken. Evidence of previous convictions for assault was allowed to go before the jury under section 101(1)(d) and section 103, and in the event both defendants were convicted. On the appeal, it was argued that since the defense was an alibi, the previous convictions were irrelevant. Such evidence, it was said, did not make it more likely that the appellants were present at the scene. The argument was rejected. The court said this: "We do not accept this submission. The jury had to decide whether the two appellants were the two young men who committed the offence. The evidence of bad character was capable of establishing that there was a propensity to commit the offence of street violence and to do so together. The evidence was capable of lending support to the conclusion which the Crown invited the jury to reach, namely that the two appellants were correctly identified as those who committed the attack. This is so even though there is no dispute in the trial that those who committed it, whoever they were, acted as aggressors. We agree with that conclusion for the reasons which we have already indicated. Such evidence may go to show that the witness or witnesses identifying a defendant as present or participating is correct in doing so." Mr. Trimmer, on behalf of Mr. Dobson, sought to distinguish Eastlake on the basis that it was a case of striking similarity. We cannot agree with that. The previous offences which were there were simply ones of street violence. It is true that in one instance the two accused had in the past acted together, but no emphasis had been placed by the trial judge on that particular fact. R vs Purcell 2007 EWCA Crim 2604 is another instance where previous convictions were held to have been properly admitted to support an identification and to rebut a defence of an alibi. Implicit in what we have just said is that we reject Mr. Borelli's argument that the evidence of propensity was only relevant in the present case of the participation of the killing, as opposed to the presence. Just in Eastlake, the propensity in question was capable of supporting the identification of the applicants as being present and participating in the offence. Indeed, it seems to us somewhat artificial in the present case to separate those two matters of present and participation. What the evidence of propensity was capable of doing was supporting the eyewitnesses' evidence of identification. In short, that what they said they had seen was correct. In other words, had they identified the right people? We can see no merit in the argument that the Crown only sought the admission of this evidence on the issue of participation and not on the presence. This is far too narrow of a reading of the judge's ruling. The judge said that this evidence of character goes to the heart of the case. Patently by that, he meant whether the two applicants were present and whether they were involved in the offence of killing. So far as the exercise of his discretion on the justness or the otherwise of admitting these convictions is concerned, we can see no basis for saying that the judge's decision fell outside the range of decisions properly open to him on the evidence. It was not Wensbury unreasonable. He had directed himself in accordance with the proper principles. As to his decisions to the jury, the judge gave the requisitive, careful directions about the previous convictions along the lines indicated in Hanson and Edwards 2005 EWCA Crim 1813. Amongst other things, he emphasised that by themselves previous convictions could not establish guilt. He also made it clear that the jury could not convict wholly or even mainly on the strength of those previous convictions. In our view, he did not need to go no further than he did. Given our conclusion on the relevance on the previous convictions to both the presence and the participation, no specific direction about the relevance of those convictions to the defence of alibi was required. The judge gave the normal direction about the Crown having to disprove the alibi, and indeed repeated it a second time in the course of his summing up. It seems to us that it must have been obvious to the jury that his directions about the possible relevance of previous convictions were relevant to the issue of identity. We say that because it was a central issue in the case. It follows that we can see no proper basis for an appeal on this first and indeed main ground which is put forward on behalf of each of the applicants, Mr. Dobson and Mr. Grime. Connected with that, but also said to be an independent ground of appeal on its own right, is the issue with the inconsistent verdicts. It is submitted on behalf of both applicants that the convictions of these applicants is so inconsistent with the acquittal of Mr. Mahorn as to render them unsafe. As a matter of oral submissions, that is the point which has been particularly emphasised by Mr. Borelli, but we take it on board in respect of both of these applications. It is submitted that the cases at trial against Mr. Mahorn and Mr. Grime are inextricably linked. We have been taken in some detail through the evidence of the three main eyewitnesses. It is said that to have convicted Mr. Grime but acquitted Mr. Mahorn was perverse. As we have indicated already, This overlaps to a degree the other ground, the admission of the previous convictions, in that it is said that the admission of Mr. Green's previous convictions must have been what made the difference, since Mr. Mahone had none that were put before the jury. The same in effect is said on behalf of Mr. Dobson. In dealing with this as a specific ground, we remind ourselves of the well-established approach as a matter of law to the contention that verdicts are inconsistent and unsafe as a consequence. The legal principles apply whether one is talking about different verdicts on counts faced by the same defendant or different verdicts in respect to two or more defendants. The essential principle is that it is necessary for the appellant to establish that there is a logical inconsistency in the verdicts, in the sense that no reasonable jury, applying their minds to the facts, could have reached those verdicts. It is not enough that it seems surprising that the jury returned the verdicts that they did, or that the appeal court itself might not have returned such a combination of verdicts had it been sitting as a jury. If there is a possible legitimate chain of reasoning which could explain the apparent inconsistency, this court will not interfere. It is open to a jury to believe a single witness on part or all of her or his evidence, but not accept another part. Those are the established principles. The present case concerned an incident which is in a critical phase, which in its critical phase was relatively brief and fast moving. It took place at night time. It seems there was a considerable number of people around. It is acknowledged by the advice of appeal for Mr. Green that there was a deal of inconsistency in the evidence given by the three main eyewitnesses. Indeed, this is prayed in aid, of course, of the submissions on his behalf. All of that is true. Perhaps, unsurprisingly, and certainly not unusually, the eyewitnesses' accounts of events differed in certain respects from each other. The jury, for its part, had to access the credibility of each of those witnesses and the reliability of their evidence in the various aspects and in the respect of each of the defendants. They had to evaluate what each of those witnesses said about each of the defendants. The jury then heard each of the defendants give evidence, just as they had to do so with the Crown's witnesses. So here again, the jury had to decide how far they believed each of the defendants. In the light of that complex assemblage of decision about at least 3 Crown eyewitnesses and the 3 accused, the jury then had to decide whether they were sure of guilt, considering each defendant separately. In considering the cases against the 2 applicants, they also had their previous convictions to consider. It was not illegitimate to take those into account. It seems to this court that, in that complicated situation, it is quite impossible to say that no reasonable jury, properly approaching their task, could have reached the combination of verdicts which the jury did. We do not know what they have made of each of the 3 eyewitnesses and the 3 defendants. As the single judge said, they may have found witness A particularly convincing when she said that she saw Mr. Green there at the relevant time, but did not see Mr. Mahone. That indeed was a point made on Mr. Mahone's behalf to the jury by his counsel. All 3 eyewitnesses said that Mr. Dobson was there and with a submachine gun. The evidence in the case was patently complex. That being so, we could see no prospect of a successful appeal on the basis that the verdicts were logically inconsistent and therefore perverse. Finally, there is a point raised on behalf of Mr. Dobson about a reference by the judge to the internet. It was a reference made at the outset of the case. What he said was this: sometimes people like to look up on the internet and try and find out anything they can about the background. What is there does not matter. I am not banning you from looking at the internet, but it is really of no help because what you are doing is deciding this case on the evidence that you hear in this court, which we all hear together. It is argued now by Mr. Dobson that statement undermines the safety of the conviction. A strong warning should have been given not to seek from the internet information relevant to the case, whereas the words used by the judge implied that it was not forbidden to look at the internet. Mr. Trimmer, on behalf of Mr. Dobson, whose submissions on this were adopted by Mr. Borelli on behalf of Mr. Green, contends that the judge in effect implied that the jury had permission to look up matters on the internet. If a juror takes into account any such material, then the principle that the defendant is entitled to see all the material on which the jury decides his case is flouted. In that connection, reliance is placed heavily on R versus Karakaya 2004 2 CR APP R5, where that principle is strongly endorsed. Mr. Trimmer has obtained some sample pages from the online encyclopedia Wikipedia. Some of the extracts post-date convictions, but others do not. They refer mainly to Dobson's musical activities, but they also include references to other offences for which he is sentenced for in 1999, along with a robbery about which they knew. Those other offences included handling theft, handling stolen goods, theft, burglary, and criminal damage. There is also a reference to him being on trial for a murder by paying someone to kill the victim. We do not find this argument persuasive. The facts here are a long way from those in Karakaya, where documents downloaded from the internet were found in the jury room and had been introduced there after their retirement. The material in question was patently relevant to the issues in the case. Here, there is not a shred of evidence that any juror sought to obtain or did obtain any such material. The submission is based entirely on the judge's comment to which we have referred. That comment could have been put in stronger terms. In our view, it would have been better had it been put in stronger terms. Nonetheless, in the course of it, the judge made it clear that no jury had to decide the case on the evidence which they heard in court. We have not been provided with transcript of the whole of the judge's remarks to the jury at the start of the case from which this extract have been taken. He came back to that again at the start of his summing up, but as the single judge said, and as Mr. Borelli believes happened, the trial judge has evidently just given the jury the unusual warning, the usual warning about not discussing the case, save in the jury room, and basing their verdicts only on the evidence which was heard. We can see no reason to believe that they did otherwise. In that situation, it seems to us that this ground provides no basis for a potential successful appeal. We have taken these various grounds separately, but looking at them whether separately or together, we can see nothing that cases us to doubt about the safety of these convictions, and nothing which merits the further detailed scrutiny of a full appeal. It follows that both of these applications must be dismissed. Mr. Dobson was in the papers again recently when it was exposed that he was in a sexual relationship with a married prison worker whilst he was incarcerated at HMP Long Lartin. Jody Malins, who worked for a courier firm DHL, bringing supplies to the canteen at HMP Lartin. The police arrested Miss Malins at HMP Long Lartin on suspicion of misconduct in a public office and smuggling contraband. In 2010, the mother of Mr. Dobson's victim, Lynn Holmes, criticised how Mr. Dobson was able to record an album using his PlayStation while he was in his previous jail, HMP Swellside. Because of this, Mr. Dobson was moved from HMP Swellside to HMP Long Lartin, which houses some of Britain's most violent criminals. Thank you for joining us today. What are your opinions on the crimes committed by Mr. Dobson and Mr. Green? Do you believe the sentences were too harsh or not harsh enough? Do you believe that Mr. Dobson, also known as Crazy T, and Anthony Green deserve a retrial, or do you agree with the appeal judge's decision? We will put the link to the petition in the description. Please check it out and let us know what you think in the comments. Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this content, please don't forget to like and share, and if you're new to the channel and you want to see more Street Crime UK content, please don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell button so you can join us on the next video. Thank you for joining us, and until next time, stay safe.